All right, welcome everybody to our session on promotion and tenure. With us from MUNFA, we have myself and Amy Wan, John Church, Dale, Labor Relations Coordinator. Excuse me. I know I meant to have a land acknowledgement, but I'm actually really losing my voice. So I'm wondering if, sorry.
Water.
Sorry, I don't know if you're able to take it.
For Josh, you cut out there. Are you handing it over to me or John? I can do it if you like. All right, I'm going to take that as a yes from Josh. Okay, just give me one moment here. As many of us are settlers here, we offer this land acknowledgement. We understand the importance of the collective agreement as we face the ongoing challenge in grappling with our colonial history. We respectfully acknowledge the territory in which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, and the island of Newfoundland as the ancestral homelands of Mi'kmaq and the Beothuk. We would also like to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Nunatsiavut and the Innu of Nipissing and their ancestors as the original people of Labrador. We strive for respectful partnerships with all the peoples of this province as we search for collective healing and true reconciliation and honor this beautiful land together. So we've done the introductions. I'm just going to run over a few pieces of housekeeping. You might have heard that we are recording this session today. We are recording this simply so that folks can refer to this session afterwards, or if anybody is unable to make it today, that the sessions are available. We encourage questions throughout the presentation. We always get lots of very interesting questions, so please let us know your questions throughout. We'll also have an opportunity at the end for folks to ask any questions they want. Because we're on multiple screens, the easiest way for us to do that is if you have a question, if you could please just type it into the chat, either directly to me or to the collective group. Either way is fine, we'll get them, and we'll ask those questions at the appropriate times once we get those questions. So again, just please put your questions in the chat, as we may not see you waving or any raised hands on the screens. As I mentioned, this presentation is going to be recorded. Those recordings are available on the Faculty Relations website as well as the MUNFA website. We also have the slides available on both websites, as well as updated promotion and tenure calendars in recognition of tomorrow's holiday. We know updated ones were sent out, but at the last session, it was actually pointed out to us that those deadlines are in fact pushed by one day, some of them, because of the holiday tomorrow. So I think that's it for housekeeping items. I'll hand it over to Ian to start us off.
Yes, thanks, Amy. Hi, folks. I'm Ian McKinnon with Faculty Relations. So I'm going to kind of take us through the presentation. And as Amy said, feel free to jump in with any questions, because that's what we find real value in a lot of these presentations is the questions. First thing I would mention is the fact that this is very much a joint presentation, very much of a collaborative effort between our office and MUNFA. Because we both have both parties have a vested interest in making sure the process runs smoothly. So next slide. So what we're going to talk about, first thing is about the rules around who can be on a committee. Then we're going to talk about a summary of the process for P&T, and then show some helpful hints regarding some common trouble areas we frequently run into. Okay, next slide. So first thing to be mindful of regarding committee composition is that in the last collective agreement, we put in language, I think it was last collective agreement, we put in language around where a candidate up for review presents a documented record of personal conflict with a faculty member who's otherwise eligible to serve on the committee, and the head determines that that conflict creates a reasonable apprehension of bias, that faculty member, that committee member shall recuse himself from serving on the committee And so for that candidate, so I think the key thing there is that it's for that candidate only. Otherwise, they stay on the committee. They just recuse themselves from serving for that candidate. And I think the other key to be mindful of there in that clause is that it has to be a documented record of a personal conflict. So it can't be just a one-off disagreement that parties may have. There has to be a documented record of a history of a personal conflict between the candidate and the committee member. And the head makes that determination whether that conflict would constitute a reasonable apprehension of bias, whereby the candidate could be, could be jeopardized. So that's it. So next slide. Similarly, where we have a faculty member who's on the committee who within the past 6 years has supervised a candidate, again, that faculty member must recuse himself from serving on the committee, but again, it's for that candidate only. Otherwise, they stay on the committee for all other candidates up for review. Some other rules around committee composition. You cannot serve on the committee if you're applying for promotion or tenure or being considered for your third-year extension review. So basically, any decision you review at all, you cannot serve. So that basically means by default that you can serve if you're up for a non-decision year review, because the collective agreement does allow for one untenured faculty member on the committee. So that being said, what would happen there is that that if a person was on the committee and they were up for a non-decision year review, the committee would review that person first. And after that review was completed, that person then would join the committee for all the other files, okay? So the other thing where a candidate can't serve is if they're in a conflict of interest with a candidate. They can still, again, they can still serve on the committee, but they must recuse themselves from serving on the committee for that candidate only. And just to point out one thing is that, because we get this question a lot regarding does collaboration with a candidate constitute a conflict of interest? And under the collective agreement, it does not. You can still collaborate. A committee member and a candidate can be collaborate on various projects and still not be in a conflict. Okay. I think there was a question came up. Amy, was there?
No, that was Erica Machado was just reminding us that the collective agreement language is gender neutral. So everyone in the collective agreement, you'll see they instead of he, she.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Now we can move on to talk about Article 11 regarding tenure. Okay. Next slide. So this is pretty basic. So I think that, what you need to be mindful of here is that other than the year one, there is a review in every year, years 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 for someone hired at the rank of assistant professor. And from that perspective, I think it's important to point out that year 4, as of the last round of collective bargaining, is now an optional year. So the candidate, if they wishes to, and if the candidate feels pretty good about everything coming out of year 3 and doesn't see the need to prepare a further non-decision year review file, then they have the option of declining that review. And then they move right to year 5 the following year. Okay, so it doesn't extend their cycle or anything. They just have the option of declining that review. And it serves two purposes: less of a burden on the candidate, and it's also less of a burden on our committee members. Okay.
Ian, just on the, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, we don't, go right ahead.
I was just saying on the last slide, we had a question, but what does exactly supervised mean? My understanding is supervised means supervising in an academic context, like a master's or supervisor, master's or PhD supervisor. That's my understanding. The question is, does that also mean work as a supervised as a staff member? Like your research assistant, I guess. And I don't know the answer.
So if just tease that out again, Amy, what was it?
I guess I was, if someone was a supervisor in the sense that they supervise, say, work in a lab, person was a research assistant. So not a PhD supervisor or a master supervisor, but they were still a supervisor, but more in a work context versus an academic context. But does that fit the language?
The language is in the context of academic supervision, right? So I think that's really where we need to kind of draw the line, right?
It was my question. Can I clarify that? The question, is that okay? So if someone who's being reviewed had been in a non-academic staff position, a project coordinator, and I had been their supervisor they had been working for the research center that I direct. That's not a conflict. Is that correct?
I wouldn't see that as academic supervision per se.
Okay.
No, right? No.
Thank you.
Just coming back to the one thing about the, when you start your first review, I think your start date will, dictate when your first review. For instance, if someone was just hired this September 1, 2021, their first review obviously would happen next September. That would be their second year non-decision year review. But yet, if their start date was not until January 2022, their first review wouldn't happen until September 2023. So again, just be mindful of the fact that your start date will dictate when your first review occurs. Okay.
We have a question from Julia James. And Julia, I'm just wondering if you could explain a little bit more about your question, because I'm not really sure what it's asking. So what's in the chat is there is distinction between supervisor and committee members. So maybe I'll just ask you to elaborate a little bit on that if it's okay.
Sure. Thanks, Amy. Sorry about that. That's about the distinction between somebody who's designated as a supervisor and someone who is designated as a committee member. So in our school, we have one or two people who are supervisors and others who are academic committee members on for instance, a PhD candidates committee. So yes, I was wondering if a supervisor is distinct from the other committee members who are not formally supervisors.
Yeah, I would see that.
Clear.
I would, in my own view, I would see that distinction there, and that the committee members wouldn't necessarily be in conflict, right? But certainly the principal supervisor certainly would, right?
Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah. Okay, next slide. So again, just briefly, we got a shortened cycle for someone who's hired at the rank of associate professor, third year review, 3 years cycle, and again, similarly, the only one other review prior to tenure, and that's in year 2. Okay. So next slide, and this is important. This is regarding the impact of COVID on the tenure cycle. Last year, the parties, both the university and MUNFA and Gale entered into an MOU last September that basically allowed for any ASM in a tenure track appointment may request a deferral for any upcoming review for up to 2 years. So that will extend your tenure cycle by, if you request a deferral, so you could request a deferral for 1 year or 2 years, whatever the case may be, at the option of the candidate. And that recognizes the impact that COVID has had on faculty members or ASMs in general regarding whether they're transition to remote teaching or their lack of access to the research facilities, and how that may impact on their tenure and their ability to apply for tenure. So as such, we did have that option is there for someone if they wish to request a deferral. And the important thing to note is if they do request a deferral and just say they apply for tenure and they're 2 years late applying for tenure other than when they normally would have, then the corresponding promotion to associate professor and the salary increase associated with that promotion will be retroactive to the date tenure normally would have been granted. Okay, so that's important to note. So there's no real downside to the faculty member from a financial aspect. Okay, so that MOU is still in effect. We had a number of ASMs did avail of it over the last year and this year. So, okay, next slide. So obviously for, as we said earlier, normal tenure decision, 6th year for assistant, 3rd year for associates, but of course the collective agreement does allow for an early tenure application, the 5th year for assistant, 2nd year for associate. And when the person does apply for early tenure, that does presume you must meet the bar of superior performance. And we'll always get a question as to what does superior mean? And it's not something that can be quantified, right? It's certainly, but we do expect superiority in teaching and in research. But, it's unique to each unit in terms of it would certainly be above the norm within your unit. So, it may be looked at differently in each unit, but it's certainly above the norm for your unit, but it's just something that we can't quantify. And the other thing to be mindful of is someone who's hired into a tenure track appointment, if they've spent, just say they spent 3 years in a term appointment prior to being hired into a tenure track appointment, if that time in a term appointment was spent here at Memorial, that time may be credited towards their tenure cycle to move up their tenure cycle. So the candidate has the option of, if they had 3 years in a term of employment, the candidate has the option of using 3 years towards their tenure cycle. So they would go right into year 4, 2 years, 1 year, or none of those years. That's again, it's at the option of the candidate. But I think the candidate has to be mindful of this in terms of, if they wish to avail of this, they need to do this before their first review starts. And they need to, submit that in writing to their head, indicating that they wish to avail of this and avail of the, otherwise, we assume that their tenure cycle starts on the day they're appointed to a tenure track appointment, right? So it's not much good coming back in year 5 or in 2 years later after they're appointed to tenure track appointment, saying, I now wish to avail of those prior years that I spent in a term of employment. So the key thing there is that the time spent in another institution does not count. It has to be time spent at Memorial.
And there's a couple questions in the chat. Thanks to John, who answered Jane's question, but just for the sake of the recording, I'm just going to read out the question. The question from Jane Leibel: I serve as a supervisor for one of the candidate up for tenure promotion. Their wife is pursuing an interdisciplinary PhD, and I'm the academic supervisor of the candidate's wife. Is this a conflict? And John's response is, I think when you start to get into these more complex, kind of murkier areas, I think everything kind of have to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis.
No, that's true. And, in those circumstances, the university will consult with MUNFA if there's some, if there's a gray area there in terms of where the parties see whether there is a conflict, right?
We also have a question from Doug Smith. Doug, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, this was about the early applications for tenure. I was under the impression that when you apply, you had to specify superior performance either in teaching or in research, not necessarily both.
No, Doug, what you're referring to is application for promotion to the rank of professor.
Okay.
That's the early tenure is just early tenure, right? It's just you're judged on the bar of superior performance, and the expectation is superiority in teaching and research.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next slide. So what happens if you apply for tenure, early tenure, and you're not successful? There's no downside. So if you apply for early tenure in year 5, and you're unsuccessful, then you just move ahead to year 6 as you normally would have, and you're reviewed. So the early tenure application then serves as your non-decision year review so you get that feedback anyway, and you use it to go ahead with your year 6 review anyway, right? Then, of course, I think everyone's aware of this, where you're automatically promoted to associate upon granting of tenure. So next slide. And of course, we also require, the collective agreement requires that when you're applying for tenure, that you provide a minimum of 3, maximum of 5 letters of external referees, letters of reference from external referees. These are solicited by the dean. And the stipulations around who's eligible to serve as a referee is that they must be external to university. At least 2 of the 3 or 2 of the 5, whatever the case may be, must hold the rank of associate or professor at a recognized university, and they must have a national and international reputation for excellence in their field. And the other stipulation is that they shall, as notice, this is different from committee members. Referees cannot currently be collaborating with a candidate, nor have collaborated in the past 5 years. Okay. So next slide. So we also always, get a lot of questions about what would constitute collaboration. And here's some examples that might be useful. Co-authoring scholarly works, holding joint research grants, co-investigators on a research project, submitting joint grant proposals, student-supervisor relationship, and joint course curriculum development. And just, the key thing is if the collaboration happened outside the 5-year period, then that's okay. But if it happened within the 5-year period, then they're not eligible to serve as a referee. Next slide. So, and again, it's important that the heads, they have an obligation to consult with candidates on the appropriateness of the names of referees. And regarding referees, it's not always, like everything, there's gray areas. It's not always black and white when we're determining whether a relationship constitutes collaborations. So for instance, contributions to an edited book one would think on the surface that might constitute collaboration, but yet if those submissions were independent of each other, it wouldn't necessarily constitute collaboration. Similarly with team teaching. If one person taught the first part of the course and the second person taught the second half of the course, again, they wouldn't necessarily have collaborated.
And we have a question about clarifying what exactly co-authoring means. Two chapter authors on the same book, or editor and contributor to a book, are these collaborating?
I mean, again, I think that just goes back to the gray area we just discussed. I think it would need to be fleshed out, right? I mean, I'm reluctant to give a blanket answer to something like that, to be honest with you, right?
I mean, I think co-authoring, if it's a partnership book where two people are, clearly
Yeah.
two authors that have written a book jointly together as a partnership, that would fit the nice definition. But yeah, I think then once we go beyond that, it gets gray.
Okay, next slide. Okay, thank you. So criteria for tenure. So the language, the first part of the language, unbolded, has been there forever. Satisfactory academic performance considering the tenure track period as a whole, demonstrated professional growth since the date of appointment, and a promise of future development. And here's where we added in the last collective agreement: acknowledging diverse career paths, traditions and values, ways of knowing, and forms of communicating knowledge. And in addition, the faculty members' teaching load, access to research facilities, and other available infrastructure shall be considered. So really, what does that mean? So, I think it's important that we, particularly as we go ahead and start, proceeding with our hiring of Indigenous faculty member, that we've been mindful of this clause, but also be mindful of the fact that this clause applies to everyone, not just Indigenous faculty that we may be hiring. But in terms of what it means, I think that's something that each unit's going to have to consider, and how that language will apply to them within their own unit. And I think MUNFA and the university are going to have to put our heads together in terms of considering looking at some training for committees in terms of how to apply this language. But right now, it's important to be mindful of the fact that this is new language, and recognizing that things are not what they were. We need to, evolve with the times. And the last section about teaching load. So, not everyone has a standard teaching load. So, some people's teaching load differs from the norm. So that's what that means. You must take that into consideration. And access to research facilities specified at the time of hire. So if the faculty members' research facilities are not what were, promised at this point of hire for whatever reason, again, and that's impeded the faculty members' research, that has to be taken into account. But again, doesn't mean we give a person a free pass, but it just means that the committees must give these points consideration. Okay. Again, what are committees responsible for? Areas of assessment: documented effectiveness of scholarly competence as a teacher, demonstrated record of research, scholarship, and creative professional activities. And just be mindful of this. In the last collective agreement, we expanded the list of factors to be considered when assessing research. So I think it's just, you need to be aware of those, because there is a number of expanded factors that committees should be mindful of. Okay, and of course, demonstrated record of service. So that's it for tenure. We can move on to Article 12. Okay, next slide. And I guess this comes back to Doug, your earlier question. Application for promotion to rank professor must state whether consideration should be given under superior teaching or superior research. So, and this is mandatory. We have seen instances where faculty members have come back and said either or both. That's not fair to the committee or the heads. So it has to be declared in terms of which of the two that the faculty member wishes to be considered under. And of course, under superior research, you still have to meet the bar of satisfactory teaching, and under superior teaching, you still have to meet the bar of substantive research. You can apply, no, can we go back one sec? Thank you. You can apply for early promotion, whether it be your promotion to associate or promotion to full. You're allowed to make one early application for each rank. An early application means before the candidate has had 5 years at the previous rank, right? And as different from early tenure, an early application for promotion is not judged on a higher bar. It's the normal standards. Just means you got there quicker, but it doesn't. We don't expect a more superior bar regarding an early application other than what's in the collective agreement. Okay. So what happens to if someone's appointed, achieves early promotion to the rank of associate, what happens to their tenure cycle? Nothing. So, their tenure review still occurs in the year it otherwise would have. So for example, just for a point of contrast, with tenure comes automatic promotion to the rank of associate, but with promotion to associate, you're not granted tenure. So, one doesn't necessarily get the other. Okay.
Ian, I'm just going to jump in there. So I just want to say to committees, you might actually see applications come in someone's 5th year where they're applying for early tenure, but might also be applying for early promotion. You might see that they're putting in 2 separate applications. So you'll have to consider their early tenure, but also their early promotion, because as we explained earlier, that early tenure has the superior aspect that needs to be kind of, evaluated with the file, and then also the promotion as well. So just keep an eye out for those types of applications.
Yeah, so in that case, they might be unsuccessful on the early tenure, but they might be successful on the promotion potentially, right? And because you're looking at the file through a different lens for each review. Okay, next one. So this again is pretty much similarly to our criteria for tenure, except the criteria for promotion is evidence of a cumulative record of performance appropriate to the rank being sought and demonstrated professional growth, and everything else thereafter is as it was in the tenure criteria. So just be okay. External letters, again, similarly for tenure, we do require external letters of external referee letters. And I think to be mindful of here, the only difference is from the referees that we ask for tenure versus what we ask for promotion. For promotion, at least 2 must hold a rank of professor, whereas for tenure, it was at least 2 must hold a rank of associate professor or professor. In this case, at least 2 must hold a rank of professor. So I think that's the key distinction that you need to be mindful of. Okay. Next point. So not sure if there's any librarians. I think I saw 1 or 2 librarians on the call here. Just to be mindful of, I know their tenure cycle is entirely different from faculty members in terms of their tenure cycle is based on their anniversary date. And there are some other distinctions regarding who can apply for tenure and composition of the P&T committee. All right. So we can move right on to next section. So first thing, you'll note that the collective agreement is very prescriptive when it comes to the P&T process, and dates, there's a lot of dates in there, and it's very much, those dates are carefully prescribed. And as such, anytime we're in a position where we find you're not going to be able to meet those deadlines, then you need to seek a change through an MOU between University and MUNFA. And we've been, the parties have had historically had a good relationship regarding agreeing on MOUs in this regard. The main thing is, as long as we get that request in a timely manner from the parties, whether it be the committee or the head. So the other thing to be mindful of is there, again, due to COVID, and it's something I think everyone's already aware, all the deadlines for P&T have been extended by 20 business days. And the only exception was clause 1111, which is where the deadline for submitting names of potential referees, that deadline was September 15th. We kept that because traditionally that is the getting external referees to agree to serve. That's been the biggest impediment about moving tenure files along. So we wanted to keep that deadline because hopefully if that process moves quickly enough, then that won't be an issue down the line, won't create a bottleneck down the line if all the other deadlines have been extended. Okay. So obviously, if a deadline falls on a weekend, the date moves to the next business day. So I think the important thing for deadlines is that for committees, as notify your head as soon as possible when you anticipate a delay, and then heads will then notify our office if there's a delay, anticipated delay, and then our office will draft an MOU, send over to MUNFA to make sure that the deadlines are still met. We'll just for that particular file, we will draft new deadlines. And this happens a lot, particularly in units, like a lot of times small units or any unit may have an inordinate amount of non-decision year reviews, may have 6, 7 non-decision year reviews to get through in a run of a year, and all of a sudden the deadline is 2 or 3 weeks out. It's unrealistic for any committee to have that much work done in a short amount of time. So, no issue. If you find that that's too much, just, seek an MOU, let your head know, and we'll do an MOU to that effect. Okay. All right. So for committees, everyone should be present during when the committees are meeting. All members should be present, but in no case shall business be conducted in the absence of more than one member or the chair. Now, if you're operating with a reduced committees, because standard committee obviously is 5, but if you're obviously in some cases a committee might obviously be down to 4 for whatever reason. So in that case, everyone needs to be present. Okay. The other thing to be mindful of, stating the obvious here, but all the business of the committee has to be kept confidential. That's crucial, right? Should be no talking in the hallways about a file. And this is stating the obvious, particularly in light of COVID. But committees can talk. In years past, I guess all committees met in person, but now of course you can meet virtually. But the main thing is make sure that all members have the necessary documentation in front of them. Next point, clause 1008, and this is, again, I can't stress how important this clause is for committees. So clause 1008 really that kicks in when a committee's initial decision is not to make a positive recommendation. It's not their final decision, but their initial decision is not to be positive. Then under those circumstances, the committee has an obligation to notify the candidate that they're not inclined to be positive, and outline in writing what the committee's concerns are with the file. And then they have to give the candidate 10 days to prepare for a meeting. The meeting doesn't have to happen within that 10 days, but the candidate has 10 days in which to, to prepare and get ready for such a meeting, and prepare further documentation and so on and so forth. And then if the candidate wishes, then again, at the option of the candidate may not wish to meet with the committee, but again, the candidate has a right to meet with the committee to address the committee's concern. And only after that process has happened can the committee make its final recommendation regarding the file. Okay, so this is important from a procedural fairness for the candidate. It's crucial that that clause be complied with, because I have seen other files go off the rails as a result of the fact that the committee wasn't aware of this particular clause or whatever. So you cannot make a final decision until you go through that clause 1008 regarding a file, whether it be for tenure or promotion. Okay, so one thing to be mindful of, we have a number of faculty members who are hired into joint appointments or or in cross appointments. And how is that impacted by P&T? Regarding a joint appointment, whenever we have a joint appointment, there's always one unit that's the primary unit. Even if it's a 50-50 split, fiscal split, there's still one unit that's designated a primary unit. And that primary unit has the responsibility for doing the P&T assessment, but the head and the P&T committee of the other unit must be consulted and the full file made available to that committee too. So it's really important. Again, the primary unit is responsible for making the final recommendation, but the secondary unit has to be consulted regarding the criteria, P&T criteria, and how that person fared regarding teacher research and service in their unit. Regarding cross appointments, a little different. The head and the appropriate faculty members of the other unit must be consulted. So it's not the P&T committee of the other unit, it's the appropriate faculty members. And what does appropriate faculty members? That would generally mean those faculty members in the other unit that the person has a working relationship with. And those people would, provide written comments regarding the contribution that candidate has made to the cross-appointed unit. Okay. So again, because of there's timelines regarding the, in the collective agreement, committees need to do their non-decision year reviews first, then followed by the tenure decisions, then followed by the promotion decisions, because that's that's the sequence in which timelines are laid out in the collective agreement. Okay.
And there's a question from Erica about communicating with the candidate about a 1008 meeting. Erica, my understanding is that's done by the chair of the committee to the candidate. Correct. So at this point, you wouldn't even need to involve the head that there is a potential negative recommendation.
No, the head should not even be made aware of this, because all that will be made clear when the committee makes their final recommendation. But at this point, the head has no involvement in 1008. It's strictly between the committee and the candidate.
Oh, no, I meant that the committee can meet with the candidate or request more information without requiring a 1008. So if you.
Oh,
require-
yes, Erica, sorry, I misunderstood your question. Yep.
Yeah, that option is there, if the committee wishes, but again, it's not the committee's job to build a file for the candidate, but the committee, prior to going 1008, they can request additional information if they see fit from the candidate prior to invoking 1008. Yeah. Okay. So teaching evaluations. It's an important thing to note, they're not required for P&T files. That's, if a candidate wishes to include them, that's entirely up to the candidate. But what it does say in the collective agreement is that if the candidate does choose to include them, all such results received during the preceding 3 years shall be included, okay? So, that's designed to prevent a candidate from cherry picking, say, I got great reviews in this course, but not so much in the other one. So you want to use them, you got to use them all that you have for the preceding 3 years.
In the last session, we had a question from an ASM who asked, what if someone wants to include beyond the 3 years, right? So they want to include maybe all of their teaching evaluations from their time. And our understanding is that's fine. And I think particularly because, I think the last year and a half, almost 2 years now, there's been, I guess, some issues with collecting student data on how on courses. So our understanding is if you see a file that has 20 years of teaching evaluations, whether CEQs or another form, that's fine.
Yep, it's again, because candidate's file is up to them what they want to put in, right? So, and again, back to teaching evaluations, they shouldn't be determining factoring when assessing teaching effectiveness, particularly in light of the fact that we do know that there are some flaws in terms of for using course evaluations for assessing teaching effectiveness. To that end, there has been a Senate subcommittee that's been working for the last year or so on a new document regarding peer review of teaching, and that's scheduled to go to Senate sometime in the next month or so. So stay tuned on that. Okay. So so again, as I said, they're not required. And again, if so if an ASM does not choose to submit them, the committee can draw negative inference from that. But at the same time, if they don't contain any other evidence of teaching effectiveness, that's grounds for negative recommendation. So, but there's plenty of ways an ASM can demonstrate teaching effectiveness without using teaching evaluations. But they have to go, if they're not using teaching evaluations, then they certainly have to use another mechanism. And to that end, the next slide.
Ian, just before you go on, there's a question there. What if someone doesn't have 3 full years of teaching evaluations, particularly if
Then
there's an 18-month gap?
Just use what you got. That's it, right? And to that point regarding the teaching evaluations, there's other tools at your disposal. The COT teaching dossier is included in the appendix of the collective agreement, and that has got numerous tools there that you can use. And the other thing I would put a plug in for CITL, they can certainly assist with putting together a teaching dossier, right? And statement on philosophy is not required. Okay. Okay, and this is again very important to note. When you're assessing a file, you've got to use the language in the collective agreement. You can't import other criteria into your decision-making process. It has to be based on the criteria in the collective agreement and the language in the collective agreement. Now, mind you, there's a clause in there that allows a faculty to adopt more detailed criteria as long as those criteria don't contradict what's in the collective agreement. And again, there's a process where they get there, and that's got to, it must be formally approved by a majority vote and approved by the provost. We've got, I think, engineering and music are 2 faculties that have adopted this more detailed criteria. Okay. And again, this last point is recommendations shall be based solely on documentation in the file. So, you can't read into the file what's not in the file. As a committee, you may be aware of some work a candidate has done. But if it's not in the file, then you can't assess it because you might be aware of it, but further up the line, the dean or the provost would have no knowledge of that. So, that's why it has to be based solely what the candidate puts in the file. Okay. So, some points around the file itself. there's an obligation to, the candidate needs to create that file in consultation with the head, and that's for the benefit of the candidate, just get some initial feedback before they submit their file for review, okay? As of the last collective agreement, there's an obligation that the files are submitted now in electronic format. And because it's the candidate's file, they can have access to it anytime. And the only caveat around that is that if the external letters are in there, candidate can see them, but the letterhead and signature head would have to be redacted before they be turned over to the candidate. But otherwise, because it's candidate's file, they can have access to it at any time. And as well, the head also has an obligation to notify the candidate of their right to include in the file any rebuttal or written comments regarding anything that's placed in the file. And when we send a file to external referees, our obligation, its expectation is the external referees should see a full file, okay? Because that's important that they see a full file. But what is removed is for external referees, the head would remove prior year's reviews and recommendations, okay? Because really the intent is that we want the referees not to be unduly influenced what other committees might have said or whatever. We want the referees to see a clean file and make their decisions strictly based on what they see in the file. Okay, next slide. The chair has an obligation before the committee does its work to communicate a list of the final contents of the file to the candidate. So that way the candidate knows, yes, okay, the committee, they got everything. So everything is good, I'm comfortable, there's nothing, they're not missing anything. And this next clause, next point, I should say, a candidate may apply to a negative recommendation as long as the final decision has not been made to the body present and reply does not include any new substantive material. So, for instance, if the committee was negative, their final decision was negative, and the committee submitted their recommendation to the head, and the candidate wishes to file a response to that, they can, but it wouldn't go to the committee. It would go then to the head before the head makes their decision. Similarly, if they want to appeal a head's decision, they wouldn't appeal it to the head. They would appeal it to the dean and or the provost, whatever the case may be, right? So it's important that it goes up the line, not to the committee, not to the body or the administrator who made that decision. So the key is, so all that is open, as long as the president has not made its final decision. So it's not something that a candidate can sit on for a month or two and wait and decide whether they're going to respond, right? So you need to be mindful of that. If you're responding to a negative recommendation, it needs to be done in a timely manner. And the other thing is that you can't include in there any new material, okay? Any new substantive material. Generally, your response to a negative recommendation is going to look like something to the effect of, the committee didn't give this enough weight, or I think the committee missed this point or misinterpreted or didn't understand this, or something along those lines. That's generally what we would see in terms of a response regarding a file. Okay. So some advice to heads. Heads are responsible for getting the committee up and running, convening the first meeting, but really they should step back then and let the committee do its work. They should only attend future meetings when invited to do so by the committee, or if they feel there's something got off the rails and they need to convene a meeting with the committee. When external referees are contacted by deans, they should the external referees need to receive the relevant sections of the CA regarding criteria. And to that end, we have provided all the deans with a model letter to be used when they're seeking external referees, to make so we got consistency across the university. But to that point, I just said up in the first point, heads can request a meeting with the committee if again, but they shouldn't do so lightly. It should be where they feel there's it should be because there's something has gone wrong, right? And as well, if you're not sure about where someone is in their tenure cycle, contact our office, because we keep a spreadsheet about where everyone is in their cycle, and because sometimes that that cycle could be varied for whatever reason, because someone took leave or someone availed of the MOU that we have this year. So again, it's not always straightforward as to what year someone's in. Okay, next slide. Just to be mindful of the fact in your calendars, P&T calendar guides, in the back of those calendar guides, we have advice and guidelines for faculty members and for committee members, I should say, regarding what happens if an ASM is being sought an accommodation regarding the P&T process. And really what would happen there is that, from a committee perspective, it would all be in the file anyway, because the ASM would have an obligation to self-identify to the head if an accommodation is being sought. And so there would be information in the file regarding the accommodation. So it's not a committee's job to suggest an accommodation or whatever. It's really the incumbent upon the ASM to seek one if they feel one is necessary. And really the purpose of those accommodations they're not meant to lower the bar, they're meant to assist someone reach the bar, right? But any specific measures would be in the assessment file, and that would inform the committee as to how to take that under consideration. And that's everything that I've got. So again, we got lots of time for questions.
Doug, go ahead with your question if you want to read it out.
Me? Yeah, so, with all the shifted deadlines and then the holiday tomorrow, I was still a little bit unsure when the deadline for an applicant to submit their file is. Is it the 30th? Is it the 1st? Or is it the 15th of October?
It's the 15th.
Of October? Yeah, I guess.
Because files would normally be submitted on the 15th of September. So I think when I did revise the P&T calendars, it used to be the 14th and now it's shifted to the 15th with the September 30th holiday.
Yeah, and it's just to be mindful of the fact that, the MOU moved everything out by 20 business days. Normally 20 business days, roughly equates to a month. But to get those exact dates, every one of those exact dates for the whole year is included in the P&T calendar guides that we have. And you can find them on they were sent out to all the units. But for ease of reference, you can find them on, Amy, I guess MUNFA has them posted, right?
We do. They're on our website. And my understanding, Ian, is Kathy is going to upload them, or they haven't uploaded to your website.
They've been on Faculty Relations website for a while. Yeah, so they're easily accessible. Yeah, and just because there's a lot of dates in there, right?
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
So I just put the link to the MUNFA website just because it was easy for me to get to. So that's the P&T info, and both calendars, updated calendars are there. I have a question from Andrea Brennan-Hunter.
Yeah, go ahead, Andrea.
Hi, with the new, the new changes to the dates, my understanding is that files would be available for the committee for starting on the 20th of October. For non-decision year reviews for departments, the letters are required on November 1st, which gives 7 business days in between deadlines. I'm assuming that there's nothing that can be done about that those dates are intractable, depending
Well,
on.
Andrew, no dates are locked in stone from a perspective. If you find the dates are not going to work, then for a particular file or whatever, then that's when you would, contact us and we'll do an MOU with MUNFA.
Okay.
It is a tight turnaround, Andrew. I think the parties recognize that. So if you have, a number of non-decision year review files to do, it wouldn't be unusual for the parties to vary that timeline to give you some extra time.
Okay.
We see non-decision year extensions, that deadline pretty much every year, multiple.
I see. Okay. I'm
Yeah,
new chair of a committee, so
don't be alarmed by those dates in terms of there's nothing there that, you know, we don't want to put an undue burden on the committee. If the committee and the heads are saying, oh my God, we can't meet those deadlines, we want to make sure that you know, the files are given their, you know, the due consideration that they deserve. So whatever time you need, just be mindful of whatever delays are there, then it will impact other files down the line. So we, you
of
know,
course,
just-
yeah.
yeah. Okay,
Okay.
no problem.
Thank you.
Ask Kyle for questions, I guess.
I'm not seeing any in the chat, but I'll just keep an eye out in case one pops up. But I would encourage anybody on the call or anybody, you know, that if you have questions between now and whenever about promotion and tenure, to reach out to Faculty Relations or MUNFA. We get questions all the time around promotion and tenure. So I think it's better to ask a question than to try to figure it out on your own. Just contact one of our offices. Question from Lisa. Yes, we will share the slides. So the slides are available on both the Faculty Relations website as well as the MUNFA website. I don't see any more questions.
Okay. Okay, Amy, I guess we can sign off and just thank everyone for attending, right?